So technically the entire dialogue is recounted by Socrates. Like, obviously there's all these characters, we're going to get into them and stuff, but it is being recounted by Socrates. And so he's saying, like, I said this, they said this, like, blah, 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 going on in that way. So the whole thing is being recounted by Socrates supposedly the day after it happened. The two main characters, the two main interlocutors throughout, they don't really talk in book one, so this is probably surprising that these are the main characters because they've hardly said anything at this point. But for the whole rest of the dialogue after book one, they're the two main interlocutors with Socrates. They are both brothers of Plato. Their names are Glaucon and Adeimantus. So Glaucon first. So Socrates and Glaucon are together at the beginning, and they're walking back from the Piraeus to Athens. And I'll get into that more in a minute. His name means gleaming eye. Oh, I have this twice, gleaming eyes and bright eyes. Glaucoma gets its name from Glaucon. It also is related to Athena and wisdom. So owl is Glaucs. So his name is kind of related to wisdom. And again, like, we talked about how Hesiod's name kind of was like weirdly connected to the content. Well, that's like even more so the case with a lot of these people's names in this dialogue. Yeah, he accompanies Socrates. He's kind of ambitious. He wants political power. To some degree, the dialogue is a conversation between him and Socrates, or more closely linked between them. A lot of interpreters recently have gone very far in this direction. Like, maybe it's actually just Socrates and Glaucon, and they're in Hades, and everyone else is like a ghost. And it's just him and Glaucon like talking, and then there's all these ghosts that they're being like haunted by, which is a crazy, interesting, cool interpretation. We'll talk about that more throughout, but like there is a lot of evidence that goes in that direction, that's kind of what's going on subtext wise. Yeah, so he's this kind of ambitious character. He wants political power. He's also like brings up pleasure and the erotic life a lot. So clearly, I mean, this is written by his brother Plato. So Plato probably knew him pretty well and like knew these things about him. And so he's like a lover of pleasures and things like that. Yeah, and then the whole thing about this maybe just being about Glaucon's soul. Socrates sort of plays this role of a psychagogue, which is what Hermes was. So Hermes like takes people out of the underworld, sometimes takes them up to the gods, things like that, transports the soul from one realm to another. This also happens in Orpheus and some other myths. So Socrates is kind of, in this made-up story, he's like taking Glaucon down into Hades and bringing him back out of Hades, and that's what happens for Orpheus, and that somehow transforms his soul and makes him a better person. So that's a crazy, weird interpretation that is probably going on at least partially throughout the book. Okay, Adeimantus, the other brother, he's more concerned about education, reliance on tradition, religion, conservative Athenian values, things derived from poetry, taking the cultural ideas at their face value, especially like the conventional views on justice, conventional views of justice, like from Hesiod and things like that. He's also generally considered to be like less creative and excited. He just gives kind of like bland answers. I think he's the older brother, so he's got this more like whatever, just like serious attitude, versus Glaucon like comes up with all these like really interesting ideas and metaphors and things like that. He also tends to be more on the side of like money and greedy lifestyle, and kind of like portrays that throughout by the things that he asks and stuff. So those are basically their character traits. We'll see them play out throughout the dialogue. The other important characters from book one, first of all, we have Cephalus. That's whose house they're at in the Piraeus. Cephalus is also the father of Polemarchus and Lysias. Lysias has like one line in it, but he's also there. And Polemarchus and Lysias are brothers. The name Cephalus means head. Like it literally just means head. Like that's what the word is. But it's kind of playing on this idea that he's this old guy and he no longer has desires or anything like that. He no longer has the pleasures and discomforts of the body. He's just like a pure mind, just a head, right? With no body. So that's kind of what they're playing on with the words there. He's an arms dealer. So he was like this rich kind of probably a warmongering arms dealer. He's a medic from Syracuse. So what medic means is someone who's from another country or another state who lives in Athens. This was like a term in Athens specifically. Someone who lives in Athens. Wow, that's so annoying. But does not have citizenship. So they had to pay all these extra taxes and stuff. And they were subject to like lots of different kinds of like persecution and like mistreatment and things like that. So he's from Syracuse, which is part of Italy, but was a Greek settlement at the time. In the dialogue, we find out that we know that he's wealthy, but he inherited his wealth primarily from his father, but the story he tells is that his grandfather like made all this money and became really rich, who also had the same name. And then his father squandered like the majority of their inheritance, and then he inherited that and then made it a little bit bigger. And that gets kind of played out again in the dialogue because his son Polemarchus inherits the conversation from Cephalus, right? So he's the second person in the storyline, and he inherits it from his father. But he only inherits actually like half the argument, as we'll see, because it's telling the truth and repaying one's debts, and he only goes for the side of repaying one's debts, so he kind of like inherits half the argument. So there's this weird play on what's going on and what happened in the characters' lives going on. Plato, there's always like multiple levels, which is what's so fun about it and also makes it really confusing and convoluted. Yeah, I said he's already dead by the time of the dialogue, and Socrates keeps saying these things like, oh, you're on the threshold of death, like you have 1 foot in the grave. Like he's saying all these like pretty insulting things. Actually, like everything Socrates says to him is pretty insulting. And then at the end, like, and Cephalus is still like, oh, I still want to be your friend. So it's kind of funny. He says he has no more desires because of old age. And he also tells us that money helps him or helps people cope with the fear of punishment in Hades. So you get this idea that like he's really wealthy. Well, he probably got a lot of his wealth unjustly. I mean, he was like a warmonger, arms dealer, so probably a lot of shady business dealings. He's old, and he's like, when you get old, you start like thinking about all the stuff you did, and you're like, oh crap, what's going to happen to me when I go to Hades? This is going to suck really bad. So that's basically what he says. And so he's like sacrificing, and he has this short little conversation. Socrates says some stuff to make him feel probably bad about himself again, and then he's like, I got to go sacrifice more. Because he's so aware of all the bad stuff he's done. He says basically that you start to think of all the bad things you've done when you get old. And he says, like, lying and leaving debts unpaid. So those are the two things he lists. And then Socrates is like, can that really be what justice is? The two things that you listed? And that's what starts the whole conversation, which leads to this much book on the problem of justice. He is portrayed as having like philosophical desires. So in another dialogue, he's like in the agora, like the marketplace, and he's like searching for somebody else, forget who who was at a conversation that Socrates had with somebody else named Parmenides, and he's like, I know that he like has a written copy of that talk, and I want to get it so I can like study it and learn it. So he's portrayed other places as like having some philosophical proclivity. In this dialogue, he doesn't show like any philosophical proclivity whatsoever. But okay, so Polemarchus, it's his house actually, I guess, that is the setting for the conversation. I guess I don't know if his dad lives at the house too, if Cephalus lives at the house. But anyway, his name literally means warlord. So Polemarchus means warlord. Polemos is like war, and Arcus is like the one in charge, or the lord, or whatever. So warlord. He brings up war as the proper context within which to understand justice. So he says first, like, justice is helping your friends and harming your enemies. But then once Socrates starts poking at this, he like turns back to the idea of war as the way to understand what justice is. So again, his name and what he's talking about kind of parallel each other. Historically, he was killed by the 30 tyrants. I'm going to bring this up again in a little bit, but remember Socrates talked about this. There was the rule of the 30 tyrants. This came at the end of the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. They overthrew the democracy and put in place these 30 tyrants. And tyranny is going to be a theme that comes back again and again throughout this whole dialogue. So he was actually like died at the hands of the 30 tyrants, which comes later. And yeah, he gives this idea that debts must be paid, right? And he cites the poet Simonides, but also it's basically just repeating what his dad Cephalus said, and he can't actually defend it. And Socrates basically makes him show he has no idea what he's talking about, but he says, I still believe that that's what it is. Okay, Thrasymachus, we haven't actually encountered him yet in our section, but he is a sophist. He teaches rhetoric. He's called a wolf and a lion. He's portrayed as being malevolent. He charges money for teaching. He literally charges Socrates to have the conversation that they have. We haven't gotten to that yet. But he's like, I'm not going to have this conversation with you unless you pay. Socrates is like, I'm totally broke. And then one of his friends is like, don't worry, Socrates, we'll pay him. And then they literally pay him and have the conversation. So he says that injustice is the greatest good. And might makes right. This is kind of the catchy little phrase that they've given to it. Basically, it means that strength, power, things like that, threats of violence are what make justice. So he doesn't think justice has any like true nature to it that's universal or anything like that. It's justice is just made up by those in power. And who makes up this the most? Who has the greatest power? The tyrant. And what does the tyrant do? Tries to make everyone give the tyrant all of their wealth and be subservient to the tyrant. So justice is something not really good at all, Thrasymachus thinks. He was potentially part of the overthrow of a democracy. We're not completely sure about this historically, but Aristotle cites him as having overthrown a democracy years later. So he's an inventor of rhetorical theory, so he actually did do some, technical scientific work on rhetoric, rhetorical theory that survives and that people thought was impressive. And as we're going to see in the conversation, he blushes, and this is a major moment in the first book of the dialogue. He blushes because Socrates embarrasses him. He realizes that he's wrong, and from that moment, he it's clear that he can learn to be different and not be unjust and things like that. So there's this key moment where he blushes. So keep your eyes out for that when you're reading. Okay, the setting is the Piraeus, which is the port city of Athens. This is Athens over here. And this is this long road with giant walls on it that leads to the port city, which also has these giant walls. So that was like a military defense thing. The Piraeus is the port city. It is the center of trade and exchange with other cities and the outside world. It's also downhill from Athens. And the very first line is katabein, which means walking down, which obviously literally you have to walk down to get to it. But it's also the first line of the Orphic poem in which Orpheus goes down, katabein, walks down into the underworld, into Hades. So the fact that it starts with that word, katabein, and that poem starts with that, every Greek who read this would have known that there's a parallel here between going down into the underworld. And it happens in a number of other poems too. It's always the same word, katabein, going down, the down going. So the first line, I don't remember I think it's just down going in the version that you have, but in this one it says, I went down to the Piraeus. But in that line, there's a lot packed in there. He's literally, literally in the sense of like metaphorically, going down into the underworld. It could also be a cave, though, and if anybody knows anything about the Republic, it's that there's this famous cave analogy, and we're going to come back to that. Caves are going to come up a bunch. Caves also, for the Greeks, were like the portal to the underworld. So it's kind of both of those things, but yeah, you go down into a cave, you go down into the they thought the underworld wasn't like we think of hell as like this fiery place, but it's like this cold place where there's these streams and stuff, and it's like cold and wet and things like that, like a cave. They're also going to this festival, or they're actually were just at this festival that goes all night, but that they saw the first half of, which was the festival of Bendis. Bendis is a goddess from Thrace, which was another city, I think it's across the Aegean, like in modern Turkey. I could be wrong about that. But the goddess of Bendis in Thrace was the same as the Athenian goddess, or that's what they said, of Hecate. Hecate is a underworld goddess. She's one of the goddesses of the underworld, like Persephone, like similar to that. Persephone? Yeah. So this brings up all these ideas of these shadows and these ghosts. Like everybody that they're talking to are like shadows and ghosts. And that there's this whole psychogoge thing. So agoge means to drag or to bring or to carry. So a psycho, like psych, means psyche, like soul. So they're carrying souls from the underworld back to the world, back and forth. So Socrates is like taking Glaucon down into the underworld. That's what the opening scene leads us to believe. And then one other idea that comes up here, there's supposedly this horse race, torch race on horseback, And that kind of gives this like metaphor for inheritance, which we've already had come up a number of times, like passing something on. You pass on the torch from one person to the next. That's literally what's going to happen in book 1. You have one person running this leg of, this is what justice is, and then they pass the torch to the next person, and then they take it, and then they pass the torch. So there's this metaphor again of like the horse race, the torch race on horseback, the relay race, and this passing on. So historically, the dialogue takes place in 421 BC. So this is when Socrates was like 50. A little bit later, he served on the Boule, which is like the council. And that was when he mentioned this in the Apology, that he went against everybody else and they would have put him to death if he would have stayed in politics, because he always did what was right when everybody else was just doing whatever the mob rule said to do. 2 years later was the 30 Tyrants. So the 30 Tyrants, just for a little bit of background on that, it was at the end of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was the war between Sparta and Athens. Basically, Athens lost. Sparta backed this new government, which was the 30 Tyrants. The 30 Tyrants ran this like reign of terror Robespierre and the whole French Reign of Terror. It's very similar to that. They got in charge and they just started killing tons of people. They killed 5% of Athens on some estimations without trial. They were just like executing people. The final battle of the 30 tyrants that led to the overthrow of the 30 tyrants and the reinstating of democracy happened in Piraeus. So again, very important symbol throughout the book, all of these things. Lysias, who was in this conversation, right, almost 20 years before, 15 years before, he helped overthrow the 30 tyrants and reinstate the democracy. And his brother, Polemarchus, died in that struggle. And this was only a few years before Socrates' death, which was in 399. Some people say that people wrongly thought Socrates was part of the 30 tyrants, and that's partially why he was put to death. I think somebody brought up something related to that. So Socrates died pretty soon after that, at around 70-something. Okay, just a quick summary of the main ideas that are going to come up in Book 1. The first is that wealth is helpful for getting away with injustice in both life and after death. This idea is going to come up a number of times. We also saw the kind of way Hesiod dealt with the idea of wealth and justice, that like excessive desire for wealth leads to hubris, or it's kind of shameless advantage seeking. So we get this idea that, it's basically materialism in the second sense we talked about from week 1, like shameless advantage seeking leading to wealth is helpful for getting away with injustice. So we saw this, like I said, with Hesiod's brother pays off the judges. They add this idea that you can pay off the gods. So, and this comes up in Homer a number of times, like you do all these injustices, you're worried that in the afterlife you're going to get, in trouble for all this stuff. Well, if you made enough money, you can pay off the gods too. So this is one of the main background ideas that Socrates is going to be against. We get a number of definitions of justice. Justice is paying one's debts. Justice is helping friends and harming enemies. Or justice is just made up by those in power. And justice is only accepted reluctantly out of weakness, fear, and stupidity. So justice, if it's those latter two things, is not something that any smart or sane person would ever choose. Along with that, we get this idea that injustice is the best thing to choose and that happiness comes from shameless advantage seeking. These are going to be the main ideas coming from Thrasymachus, as we'll see. So that's the first half, of the ideas that Socrates disagrees with. Then Socrates gives his own views on this, at least to some degree, in a very coded way, but he says that basically justice involves intelligence, virtue, these different activities of the soul. It involves benevolence. So he thinks that none of the prior definitions, none of the definitions that they give, are able to deal with this aspect of justice. So this is what they all miss. All of the theories of justice given throughout Book 1, they all lack clarity on what is the soul, what is intelligence, what is virtue. And without knowing those things, they can't know what justice is. So that's Socrates' main position. You'll see every time he argues against these people, he comes back to things related to the soul or knowledge. He brings up the examples of arts multiple times. Art skill, those kinds of things, they're forms of knowledge. So he keeps coming back to the idea of knowledge in order to frame how all their definitions are wrong. And basically, Socrates' view on all of this is that the soul itself must be improved if the truth of justice is going to be known. So it's not possible for just anyone to know what justice is. In order to know what justice is, you actually have to improve your soul. And then he gives this strange idea about punishment. He says that, we already saw this partially in the Apology, that the proper punishment of ignorance and injustice is to learn. So he says that it's never right to harm anyone. So punishments cannot be harms, which is a radical idea. And then he says an even more radical idea, which is that the punishment for just and wise people is that we should force them to be the rulers. And he basically says that no one who's just and wise will want to rule because they'll see that actually power is a burden, not something to be striving for. And so people who are just and wise will need to be forced to rule. Okay, I just gave you away like the biggest insights to the book. Those are like the main ideas, and we're going to have to glean those out throughout the next few weeks. But those are the main ideas Socrates is trying to get across. He's going to do it in a really sporadic, convoluted way, but those are the main ideas. Another main theme that comes throughout this part of the dialogue and the book as a whole is the relation between body and soul. On the side of the body, you have all of these things like the desire for wealth and fame and power. And on the side of the soul, you have these things like knowledge, virtue, and friendship. And so a lot of this is going to be about steering the conversation away from what is justice in the body to what is justice in the soul. And at the beginning of book 2, Glaucon is going to take over the conversation. They're going to leave all these people behind. And he's going to say, Socrates, you need to teach us what the effect of justice is on the soul. Like, I don't care whether it gives you wealth, like if being unjust gives you wealth, or if being unjust and having wealth can make you pay off the gods, all of this stuff. I don't want to know what the material effects are, the effects in the world and among the body. I want to know what the effect on the soul is of justice. And so that's what gets the whole discussion that is the rest of the book going. What is the relationship between justice and the soul? So for now, we're still in the realm of body, wealth, fame, power, those kinds of things. It's going to get shifted to the realm of knowledge, virtue, friendship, truth, things related to the soul. And one last idea that Socrates keeps hitting on that helps make sense of what he's trying to say a lot of times is that if one lacks knowledge of use, so how to use a knife, one should refrain from using a knife, right? And this goes to like what he says to Miletus in the Apology. He's like, who knows how to make a horse better? If you don't have knowledge of horse breeding, then you're going to make the horse worse. You're not going to know how to actually improve a horse, right? So there are only certain people who have the skill of making people better, making people's souls better, right? And he basically says, if you don't have that skill, all you're going to do is make your soul and other people's souls worse. Okay, here he's talking about people who do injustice, because he thinks that you do injustice out of ignorance, right? So he says basically, and this, let's see, I thought I had this written down here. Oh yeah. This comes from another dialogue, but this encapsulates this idea. He says, for those who don't know how to use the soul, it is better to put it to rest and not live than to live acting in accord with their wants and self-interest. So this gets back to that idea from the Apology that the unexamined life is not worth living, right? the soul, if it doesn't have self-knowledge, if it doesn't know what's good for the soul, what makes the soul better, then it will hurt itself and its life will not be worth living. Okay, so these were the definitions of justice one more time, just really fast. We're going to go through these in detail in the next class. But Cephalus says that it's telling the truth and paying one's debts. Simonides, who kind of comes in between the two characters, he's this poet that they just bring up. He says it's giving each their due. And then they analyze, what the heck does that mean? And he says, oh, it means helping your friends and harming your enemies. Right? Then Thrasymachus later, after they debate that issue, he'll say it's whatever authority says to do. That justice is basically might makes right. That strength, like if I have authority and I tell you to do something, no matter what it is, that's what justice is. That's Thrasymachus' view. And basically he's hiding in this definition of justice that he actually thinks that justice is terrible and that no one should choose justice. You're an idiot if you choose justice. You should always choose injustice. Injustice is better and leads to happiness. Everybody wants to be a tyrant. Everybody wants to do injustice to people. The only reason we don't is because we don't have the courage to do it. So this is Thrasymachus' view. It's the ultimate cynical, shameless, advantage-seeking position. And then Socrates' view is that justice is knowledge of the good, self-knowledge, knowledge of what is good for oneself, knowledge of what is good for others, and benefiting others. So he says that it's never just to harm anyone. A just person will only benefit other people. So he says these kinds of things throughout. So those are again, I'm like kind of giving away all the answers on the first day, and we're going to go through this again and try and make sense of all these ideas as we go. Okay, and one more thing to just hit on that Socrates talks about throughout the whole thing is this analogy between skill and justice. I already mentioned this in terms of knowledge. We can't really understand what justice is unless we understand what knowledge is. Knowledge is a kind of thing that happens in the soul, so we better know what that is. Also, if the soul is the cause of knowledge. So he makes these analogies. People know what an analogy is, right? One thing, you understand one thing through another. You understand one kind of relation through another kind of relation. So, yeah, that's what an analogy is. Okay. So he makes these analogies, and he's going to keep using this analogy throughout the book, but it's going to change, and that's crucial to how Socrates teaches us philosophy. So the first iteration of every analogy is not final. He'll revise it and improve it. But so the basic thing is that every art, so let's say it's horse breeding, it has a certain excellence, which is doing that well, breeding horses well so that you make good horses or dogs or whatever. The art is a skill at benefiting something, what? The horse, right? So you make the horse better if you're a skilled horse breeder. Or if it's a doctor, you're able to cure people. So you're able to benefit someone. So each skill has an excellence and it benefits something. And it involves knowledge, right? In order to have a skill, you have to have knowledge of what's beneficial. So doctors, what do they have knowledge of? What kinds of cures to give? What kind of diets to assign? What kind of, lifestyle to assign? Things like that. A ship captain has its own as well. So in each case, we have these same set of concepts related to each other in basically the same way. So then he wants to apply that to philosophy. Philosophers are like horse breeders and dog breeders insofar as they must educate people, and they have to have the knowledge of how to do that in the right way. They're kind of like doctors, he thinks, because they heal people's souls. If your soul is full of all these desires and that are at odds with each other, the philosopher needs to somehow cure that and make your soul search for truth and for justice. And the politician for Socrates, like the one who actually has the ability to benefit their community, they're kind of like a ship captain. They give these commands and everything like that to all the, crew in order to actually make the voyage without crashing the boat. So he makes this analogy with all of these things. And then this idea of lacking knowledge leads to harming. So he equates harming, vice, and this idea of like shameless advantage seeking, all of that with ignorance. You only do that kind of stuff because you're ignorant and you don't realize that it's actually hurting yourself. And the one last thing that analogy lets us do, and this again points to the soul and the power of knowledge, is that we can gather all of these different instances in which there's a common conceptual structure. And after investigating all of these different things, we can come to ideas that go beyond them, that are more general than them, right? And in this way, the mind improves itself by thinking, right? We think, and that process of thinking brings the mind to greater understanding. So the exercise of the mind brings about the increased ability for the mind to act. It's like exercising to get stronger. The mind does that with ideas. The more it thinks about all these different ideas, the better it gets at thinking. And that's going to be his ultimate, again, I'm like kind of giving away the end of the book and you have to do all the work now to understand why this is the case, why he thinks this. But justice is kind of the ability for the mind to improve itself. So when Glaucon says, what does justice do for the soul? The answer is, it is how the soul improves itself and makes itself more just. Okay, so we're just going to hit really quick on his conversation with Cephalus. And then next week, we're going to go through all the arguments on justice. So at first, he just says, oh, Cephalus, what's it like to be near death? Is it hard or is it painful? And Cephalus says, well, I have all these old friends. They hate it. They think it's terrible. They lament not being able to go to parties and have sex and do all this fun stuff. And he's like, I think that that's all stupid. I love being old. I don't have any bodily pleasures whatsoever. Like, I don't desire any bodily pleasures, right? So my elderly life is great. And Socrates is like, he's like, oh, I thought it was so interesting what I said, so I wanted to encourage him to say more. And then he's like, just insults him to his face, which is hilarious. He's like, isn't your happiness not due to your character, which is probably pretty bad, but your wealth? And he's like, he's like, well, you could still be rich and be miserable. And he's like, okay. He's like, you seem like you're not that attached to your money. You must not have actually earned it, which again is an insult. And he's like, well, I actually did inherit a lot of money, but I also made it more. And then he says, what is the greatest benefit of being rich? And he says, well, it's not what most people think, because most people think it's just having comforts, but it's not about having comforts. It's about being able to pay back all of the injustices you did. So again, this points to him having terrible character, having committed horrible injustices probably throughout his life. Now he's old, he's trying to sleep, and he wakes up in the night oh my gosh, I'm going to be tormented in Hades for eternity for the stuff I've done. So what can he do? He can sacrifice to the gods. He can bribe the gods. He can pay back people he wronged, all of these things. So that's what's great about wealth, is that it allows you to get out of all the bad stuff you've done throughout your life. And Socrates then goes, oh, is that really all that injustice is just lying and not paying debts? Couldn't there be other unjust things? And Cephalus is like, gotta go. Got more sacrifices to make. Passes the conversation on to his son, who then takes up the question in a new way. He only takes up half of it. Again, like I said, they literally say like 3 times, like, you inherit my, like, what I give you, which is not great because Socrates just proved it wrong, right? It's not a great inheritance. And he gives up half of the argument, which is about truthfulness. And right, truthfulness would have connected the whole conversation back to the soul and to the mind, but that whole part gets left behind. Socrates will bring it up later in the dialogue, but for now, it's all about the body, it's all about commerce, it's all about death, these questions that we talked about with Graeber, right? Yeah, so that's the main context of the Republic. Next class on Wednesday, we're going to go through all of the accounts of justice and injustice. I'll send you a new version of what you already read. So I'm going to send you all of book 1. And I'm going to send you what the specific pages are. So look in the email too for that and read that for Wednesday. No problem.